Welcome to Friday Forum. Today is June 26, 2026. This is the 242nd Friday Forum in the series. The series is hosted by ICLR, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. We are Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Our mission is to make Canada more resilient to natural disasters. Each month, we present recent research related to that mission. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer Dr. Keith Porter. I am speaking to you from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Halifax is in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. 3 weeks ago, Bob Robichaud presented the 2026 annual hurricane forecast. You can find the video slides and a transcript at www.iclr.org/workshops. In 2 weeks, on July 10th, 2026, 3 speakers will talk about wildfire. They're going to tell us about tools to visualize how wildfire spreads into communities. Our speakers will be Jason Brooks, Dave Winokur, and Ralph Blomers. Today, my ICLR colleague Dan Sandink is going to present a field trial for building above-code wildfire resilient homes in BC. Here's why I think that matters. Wildfires now cost Canada $600 million per year in insured property loss, perhaps $1 billion when we add in uninsured losses. One might imagine that adding wildfire resilience to new design would hurt affordability, but as Dan's going to show, innovative builders can adapt when they add new building resilience features. They find compliant solutions that fit their existing design cost structure, and fire-resistant buildings can be easier to insure, which means that resilient homes can cost less to own in the long run. Dan is ICLR's Senior Director of Resilience Programs. He's an expert in the Canadian Building Code. He led our efforts to create the Good, Better, Best checklists for new design. Those are drawing universal praise for their clarity and brevity. And he leads ICLR's Resilient Homes Task Force, which initiated the field trial we're going to hear about today. Now, before Dan begins, here's our agenda. Our webinar will last 90 minutes. Dan's going to present for about half that time, then I'm going to moderate Q&A for the second half. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box. I'll try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. If we get a lot of questions, I may only pose your first one. Then I'll move on to others, then circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded, and ICLR will post the speaker's slides and a link to the video in the next day or so. If you have colleagues who couldn't attend, let them know. You can find them at www.iclr.org/workshops. Dan, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Keith. So a quick review of the topics I'll talk about. So as Keith mentioned, I'll talk for about maybe 45 minutes. I'm going to focus on one of the field trials that we've been engaged in that have been part of the Resilient Homes Task Force collaboration that we have with the Canadian Home Builders Association. I would say, so this was the first field trial, and I'm going to kind of focus on the process and the outcomes of that field trial and the implications of resilience field trials generally, especially in partnership with CHBA and the home building industry, and what impact they can have in terms of moving the concept of resilient construction forward. So I'll talk a bit about the task force initiative. I'm going to talk about why we have focused on field trials as one of the important outputs of this initiative. Pardon me. Keith mentioned the resilience guidance, the tiered checklists. I'll review that quickly because that's kind of foundational for the field trials and for the work with the Canadian Home Builders Association. I can talk about the field trial process, and then I'll talk specifically about the big block construction field trial in the Fernie area, so its location, the way that we develop the field trial process with the builder, and their decisions with respect to application of resilience measures, in this case for wildfire, and then some of the findings and conclusions from the field trial, both general findings and findings that relate to conducting field trials and future field trials that we'll conduct with as part of this initiative. There is a paper on this topic we put out just a few weeks ago You can find it at the link there on our website. This is actually the first paper that ICLR has produced that has been co-authored by a building executive, building company owner, in this case, Alex Miller, who owns and runs Big Block Construction. So kind of a watershed paper, I think, for ICLR. So for those of you, pardon me, who are new to ICLR, I think probably most of you are familiar with us. But we work, we're a disaster risk reduction research organization. We're affiliated with the University of Western University in London, Ontario, although we have staff in different parts of Canada. Keith works in London, I work in the GTA, and then we have staff in Winnipeg as well. But we're a national organization and we focus on national topics with respect to disaster risk reduction. One of the core areas of work of our organization is residential construction, specifically Part 9 residential construction, so low-rise, typically wood frame residential buildings, for a number of reasons that I'll describe in a minute. Historically, our organization was very much an academic organization. We focused on producing, academic outputs related to performance and vulnerability of buildings in the built environment. There's some examples of the work at the top of the screen there. We've been working for years and years with the wind engineering group at Western University. Some of the work that we're doing with the task force is focused on applying this work. And we've done similar work on basement flood protection, on post-wildfire inspections, and so on, all trying to understand how buildings perform and what risk reduction options could be applied to reduce risk. Over the past 10 or so years, we've also been fairly heavily involved in developing standards and guides at the national level. And then more recently, we've been largely engaged in application. So we've gone from the academic work to developing standards and guides through government agencies to now working with industry, working with the insurance and building sectors to find opportunities to apply resilience practices. And that's where I would place the Resilient Homes Task Force work sort of on our application side. I should also note, if you're not familiar with ICLR, we're affiliated with the insurance industry as well. So a lot of our work is motivated by insured loss. On that topic, so I mentioned before, we focus on residential construction. One of the reasons why we focus on residential construction is because that's what we see driving a significant portion of disaster losses, insured catastrophe losses in Canada. And so my charts here are just providing examples of the proportion of loss associated with personal property claims associated with catastrophe events in Canada. So when you add up all the events over the past 10 years, 2016 to 2025, we find that personal property losses, so losses associated with residential buildings, contents, additional living expenses, account for most, 2/3 of overall losses. And when we break this out into the main drivers of insured loss, hail, wildfire, pluvial flood, high wind, we also find across those hazard drivers of loss that residential buildings drive the greatest proportion of loss. So that's why we focus on that topic. And I'll describe that our Resilient Homes Task Force is focused on these 4 topic areas. As you probably know, we're also seeing generally both insured loss and societal losses associated with catastrophes increasing in Canada. This is a recent paper by Dr. Keith Porter, indicating the trend in disaster losses in Canada. The dark blue bars on the bottom of the chart are insured losses. The green bars are uninsured property, commercial, auto losses. And then he's also factored in additional drivers of loss for society, the social cost of carbon associated with reconstructing affected buildings after disaster events. The point here is that we have increasing trend. If we look at both insured loss and societal losses, we find that overall losses are over 2 times, growing at a speed of over 2 times just the insured losses. The annual increase is about 9 times population increase. So it's a significant problem. And one of the things that we do have available to us with respect to the 4 major drivers of loss is good technical information on how to reduce the impacts of these events. So when we're thinking about homes and communities and exposure to wildfire, urban, pluvial flood, high wind, hail. We have pretty good technical information on these topics. We generally know how to protect buildings, but we found that there's been very little uptake of these measures in the building industry and society generally. And so one of the things that we wanted to tackle, and this slide here, I'm showing some of these resources, the NRC Wildfire Guide that was released in 2021, a map by Ernie et al. Indicating areas of Canada that are exposed to wildfire. For example, my general point here is that we generally know where we're exposed to hazards and we have pretty good sense of how to protect buildings, but by and large, we're not making much significant progress in terms of protecting buildings from these events. So we approached the Canadian Home Builders Association a few years ago, and we argued that we should work collaboratively to address this issue, the sort of gap between available practices and implementation on the ground of resilience. The argument was that both of our industries, the home building industry and the insurance industry, would both benefit from better understanding of resilience practices and building capacity in both of these industries to apply these measures. So we started the discussions with the task force back in February 2024. We've now completed the first phase of the work with the Resilient Homes Task Force, and we're moving on to our second phase. With the initial group of our task force, we developed a strategy. The strategy was sort of a roadmap to move from isolated application of resilience practices in the building, insurance, renovation contracting industries to more mass market application of those measures. And there's a number of projects that we pursued to build capacity in those industries. Field trials was a big part of it, as were guidelines, and so that's why I'll focus on those topics today. Aside from field trials and guidelines, which again I'm going to talk about mostly today, we produced a lot of outputs during the first 2 years of work under the task force. And actually, I presented Tamara, my colleague, over the past few months to the Friday Forum group and described some of the outputs, like our market research studies. We've done lots of engagement with different groups. But one of the things that we explored at the last meeting of our task force back in December, which of the outputs of the initial phase of work with the task force were the most impactful or had the most significant implications. And so we went through an exercise with the task force back in December, and we had them rank the outputs of the first phase of the Resilient Homes Task Force. And this is what we decided were the most impactful outputs: the guidance documents, which I'll walk through quickly, and the field trials. Those were considered by especially the building industry as some of the most important outputs of the first phase of the task force. Promoting resilience for homeowners, strategies for increasing market demand for resilience practices, given the fact that most of the practices that we're promoting are not incorporated in codes currently. So they would have to be sort of implemented or driven by builder willingness to implement, which depends on market demand, policy proposals, and so on. We're all part of it. Most of the outputs of the first phase of the field trial were of the task force strategy were supported by field trials. So field trials supported development of guidance documents. They have been very useful in builder training. They helped us authenticate the resilience measures that we produced in the guidelines, which I'll talk about shortly. They're helping us work with builders to promote resilience measures for homeowners, home buyers. Builders are now sort of thinking about markets for marketing resilience measures. So a lot of the work of the task force and our outputs for the first 2 years were supported specifically by field trials. So it's an important element of the work of moving from sort of isolated application of resilience to wider application. Also, during this meeting in December with the first phase of our task force, we set ourselves up for the next 5 years of work, and we agreed on 6 key strategic areas. Number 1 was field trials. That included finalizing our current field trials and initiating new field trials, supporting our guidelines, educating and engaging different members of the home building and insurance industries, marketing to consumers, pursuing some work on government relations, and looking at facilitating sharing of data between the home building industry and the insurance industry. So our next phase of the task force, which we started as of the last few months, we sort of agreed back in December that we should continue this work. We still have our industry representation from the home building industry and insurance industries. We have a co-chair, Rick West, who is the president and CEO of Triple M Housing, who's co-chairing the task force from the building sector side, and Susan Pinwarden from Aviva Canada, who's continuing her role as co-chair on the insurance side. And we've now also established a 5-year MOU with CHBA, so we'll continue the work of the task force over the next 5 years with the support of the task force members and ongoing collaboration with CHBA and members of the building industry. This is our new strategy. So again, emphasizing the role of field trials, recognition and adoption of the guidelines that we produced in the first 2 years, which I'll walk through quickly. Industry education and engagement. These are all important components of the work, but the field trials and the guidelines seem to be the core of the work. So currently we have a number of field trials that are ongoing as part of the Resilient Homes Task Force initiative. There are, well, 6 plus field trials. We currently have one that's nearly finalized with Empire Communities in Caledon, Ontario, where we looked at we incorporated high wind, basement flood and hail protection practices into a demonstration home. We're working with Avalon Master Builder in the south end of Calgary on a MERB development that includes wind and hail protection. I'll talk about the big block construction project in the Fernie area. We also started earlier this year a field trial with Farsight Homes based in Southern Ontario that will lead to a demonstration home in Bowmanville, but hopefully also wider adoption of practices by that company. And we're looking at high wind, basement flood and hail with Farsight. We completed a roof cover replacement field trial with Durham Region. In the last couple of months, we incorporated high wind protection measures into the re-roofing jobs of 5 houses throughout the Durham Region. And that's led to continued work with some of the local area municipalities there. And then we've just initiated a project in collaboration with CHBA and National Research Council where we'll be running field trials with renovation contractors. And the idea is to kind of replicate what we've done with the new home builders, only with renovators. Currently, we have a demonstration set up with a renovator or a project set up with a renovator in Bellevue, Alberta, a Crow's Nest Pass area, which is wildfire prone, wind and potentially hail prone as well, and a renovator in Guelph. And we're looking for 2 other renovators. So we're expanding our field trial work from new construction to the renovation contracting industry as well. So why do we do field trials? So I mentioned it's an important element of the work with the task force and with the home building industry. There are multiple outputs or outcomes of field trials. Initially, the plan or the impetus to conduct field trials was to inform our guidelines. And I'll talk about the guidelines shortly. So we developed guidelines on resilience that were based on existing standards and guides that are available from CSA and others that we were involved in developing over the past few years. And what we wanted to do was not just sort of develop paper-based exercise and like interview people and do surveys and so on. We wanted to actually apply the practices in the field and get a real sense of the actual implementation cost. What issues would builders have in applying these measures with their trades, in sourcing materials. How does it fit into the construction workflow and the timeline? How does it affect permitting? All those details we really could only explore through application of measures in the field with builders. So that was kind of the primary motivation, to really get a good understanding of application of these measures in the field and have this information feed back in to our guidelines. The field trials have also been providing good implementation examples, so sort of serving to demystify resilience practices. So now we have actually like photo and video evidence of application of resilience measures that we can use when we get questions about what the installation actually means. Documentation of technical outcomes is also important, costing, supply issues, and the paper we wrote with Alex and Sonia Winkleman from CHBA is an example of this work. The field trials also have given us an opportunity to work directly with builders and actually, protect a certain number of homes from locally relevant hazards. So that's certainly a benefit as well. It's really helped improve relationships in the sector. So the conversation totally changes with the building sector when you actually work with building companies and apply the measures with them, as opposed to like sort of creating documents that would go on a website. There's much more legitimacy for these practices when they see examples of builders buying in and actually applying them in the field. We've also had some experience like driving the supply chain. I would say an example is PV panels and hail resilience. And as I mentioned, we've got other field trials ongoing. But simply having builders request through their suppliers resilient materials that weren't previously available puts those materials on the radar of suppliers, and they start looking into supply issues and so on. So that's one of the sort of like, I would say, secondary outcomes of field trials. And then we also have an opportunity to demonstrate progressive builders like Big Block Construction and Empire and Avalon and all the builders that we've been working with. At a higher level, the route that we're trying to follow, I think, kind of mirrors what has been done in greenhouse gas and operational carbon, in application of energy efficient HVAC systems and so on. And we're sort of applying a market transformation exercise where we want to move from theoretical or academic practices to market acceptable practices. And there's been a lot of work done in this field, and this is one example of sort of a strategy or the necessary conditions for market transformation. This is from Energy Minds conference a few years ago, where they were promoting energy efficient HVAC systems. But the argument there was that in order for market-wide adoption of new technologies in the building sector, a number of conditions have to be met. The building sector needs to be aware of practices or technologies. The technologies have to be available in the Canadian marketplace or in local marketplaces. They have to be actually manufactured. The practices, the technologies have to be available from manufacturers. The practices have to be acceptable, so they have to fit the workflow. They can't introduce significant technical complexity into the construction of buildings. They have to be affordable. They can't introduce significant additional cost. And I would also add the concept of marketability. This is something, especially because we're promoting voluntary measures. Builders need an opportunity to sort of differentiate themselves from a market perspective when they apply these measures to at least recoup some of the costs associated with applying them. And what we're finding is that addressing or understanding each of these elements of market transformation really does require application on the ground. The technical knowledge part of the field trials is also important. So as I mentioned, we want to apply the measures, learn from application in the field, and have that information feed back into our guidelines. And these are all just examples. This is notably from the Empire field trial, where we applied things like different gradings for sewer laterals so we could sort of better accommodate backwater valves. Empire installed a whole continuous load path and some lateral load connectors that were not common in construction practice. And we learned a lot through working with them, working with their modular builder supplier, about the details of applying these practices and what's required to apply them, again, to make sure that what we're recommending for the industry is practical. So there's a number of outputs from the field trial projects that you can access, and I'll provide a link shortly to our Resilient Homes Task Force page. I would say we have sort of public outputs, things like media interviews, press releases, and that sort of thing. That's more open for the public generally. We have industry associated outputs. So part of what's being produced from the field trials is like videos and web content aimed at other builders of the building sector generally. We're communicating with the insurance industry on outputs of the field trials, especially as it relates to costing of practices, material availability, and so on. And then output of more technical outputs. And there's some examples on the right. Technical papers, publications, and usable materials for the building sector. One example is aside from the technical reports, one of the things that we're doing with builders is as they are installing the measures in the field trial homes, where we have a videographer on site who is recording application of these measures with the intent of providing practical information to other builders that might explore applying these measures. So instead of sort of talking about or suggesting floor-to-floor connections, we now have a specific relatable example of how it's actually done in the field. And these examples can be helpful in training trades and so on, and getting them on board with application of these measures. So there's a whole bunch of outputs that are related to field trials, but that's sort of demonstrating why they're so important. All of these sort of multiple outputs that we get from field trials. Another important output of field trials is that they can kind of serve as the core of strategic partnerships. And I've got a couple examples here. We've got lots of really good partnerships now. And the guidelines and field trials, I think, really set the basis for us to have good partnerships and promote the concept of resilience. And one example is Quality, which was enticed to work with us because of the tiered guidelines and sort of the stepwise approach that builders could potentially take. They worked with us and Farsight to coordinate the IDP work for a field trial in Southern Ontario that's sort of starting up now. And they're sort of serving as an Ontario node of information that has been helpful to us to get our perspective out into the industry. And again, that's, I think, really dependent on usable resources and working on field trials, providing examples of practical application of these measures. Another example is the Durham Region re-roofing field trial. So I mentioned before, we've been working with Durham Region. We provided a small subsidy to a number of re-roofing companies that included, so that they could apply measures for re-roofing jobs for wind resilience. That included underlayment and shingles with high wind resistance and so on. We did 5 pilots with them, and the feedback from the roofing companies was really good. And so now the town of Whitby has elected to continue on with the program, and potentially it could spread through the rest of Durham Region. So for a relatively small investment in time and a few examples, we now have more of an established approach that would support wind resilience in this region. So that's why we do field trials. The basis of the field trials I mentioned is the resilience guidelines. So I'll quickly walk through that element of our work. So as I mentioned before, we have lots of technical resources in Canada that focus on or provide guidance for resilient construction. For example, in terms of what we've been applying through the Resilient Homes Task Force, CSA Z800 has been sort of the core document for basement flood protection. There's a whole bunch of other resources that we draw on. For high wind, it's been CSA S520 and the benefit cost assessment that Dr. Keith Porter led. For wildfire, the NRC Wildfire Guide for Canada has been sort of the core document, along with other documents as well, and I'll talk about that shortly. And for hail, there's a number of resources that we've been relying on. One of the first things that we did with the task force, and we had a pilot working group as well, we wanted to get a sense of issues that they had with these existing guidelines, why they weren't being adopted in the industry. And we talk about it more in the report, but a few issues that they identified for us was, number one, the standards that were being produced, like CSA S520, Z800, they use normative language, they're a bit impractical, they use internal referencing, they're long, they're technically complex, they don't really lend themselves well to application by a builder that isn't already sort of bought into the concept of resilience. So they're a bit on the technical side, a bit too complex to adopt. Like, you can't just drop a 75-page standard into the lap of a builder and have them apply it. There's also some elements that they consider to be impractical, like new building practices that they were not familiar with or the industry was generally not familiar with. There was limited information in these guidelines and standards about implementation cost. Sometimes there is inclusion of suggestions or recommendations for building materials that are just not available in the market in Canada. The concept of like full package framing. So for example, CSAS 520, the idea is that you apply the entire document, and that's something that just wasn't going to work for builders to apply a whole new set of practices that would potentially introduce a lot of time requirements, training requirements, new suppliers, and so on. And then, of course, the one of the issues with standards generally is paywalls and accessibility. So these were some of the issues that were identified in terms of why they hadn't already engaged in these topics or what the barriers were for applying the standards that I mentioned before. One of the other issues that we run into often is the concept of climate resilience is often kind of subsumed or brought into the umbrella of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's already a bit of like, I guess, reticence in the building industry about applying these measures. And when we're tacking our concept onto this already somewhat, I mean, there's already pushback against it. We tie our measures onto that concept. There's sort of additional pushback, like it's more cost, more complexity. So part of what we were trying to do was sort of separate to a certain degree our measures from the wider concept of greenhouse gas and climate change risk reduction. And so the task force and our working groups advised that we develop a tiered approach. As I mentioned before, and talked about this in the Friday forum a few months ago, but we have a tiered checklist and guidelines with 3 tiers: good, better, best. Good is kind of a basic tier. Best is a high-end tier that would provide sort of more comprehensive protection for buildings. The purpose of the tiers is to address risk reduction. So as ICLR is a risk reduction organization, we want to reduce risk. But we also need to listen to the building industry and reflect their concerns about constructability. So our basic tier is meant to reduce risk, but also rely on measures that are low risk to builders, that are technically mature, that are incentivized in some cases by insurers, and that are comparatively low cost and low complexity. The best tier helps us, keep sight on the fact that we are not providing full resilience for homes if we're only applying the basic tier. The best tier essentially would require applying the full resilience standards and guidelines that I mentioned before, where there's a strong emphasis on the performance of buildings as opposed to cost and practicality issues. So far, the work with the building industry indicates that it's going to be quite some time before we get to the best tier. And we're probably going to be working for the most part, with the good or better tier for a while. The better tier is kind of a compromise best tier where we're applying a lot of the same concepts, but making accommodations for cost and material availability and so on. So these guidelines and also a number of the outputs I mentioned before from the field trials are available at this website, so you can check those out. We have the tiered guidelines now available for the core hazards: wildfire, basement flood, high wind, and hail. The guidelines also include some other elements. There's introductory material. There are technical sheets. The technical sheets are meant to back up each of the elements of the checklist. So we have very simple language in the checklist, sort of outlining very basic language, resilience practices, and each of those items in the checklist have more detailed documentation, 1 or 2 pages, that include photos and 3D drawings, what to look for in building specs and so on, to make it a bit more practical. And we also include some high-level information on incremental cost, on supply issues, on practicality, and so on. And then we also have in each of our hazard areas sort of a primer on insurance incentives, or how insurance might reflect application of resilience practices, which is another big area that builders wanted us to include in any guidance that we put out into the market. So those, again, are available at that website for totally open access and for free. And we're, of course, interested in your comments and feedback on those guidelines. So in terms of the resilience options for wildfire that were explored as part of this field trial, I'll walk through the guidelines, but first a quick review of some of the important mechanisms for ignition during wildfire events. There's generally three recognized drivers of ignitions when we have wildfires: embers, radiant heat, and direct contact with flames. Evidence in Canada and elsewhere indicates that embers are an important driver of loss. On the left are examples of an ember shower in a building that was ignited via embers during a wildfire event. The building in the middle, this is from Alan Westhaver's paper a few years ago for us. You can see that the vegetation around the building had not ignited, but the building ignited due to ember buildup on vulnerable components of the building. And each of these mechanisms of fire, of ignition, are addressed by different approaches for resilience that I'll talk about shortly. So for the guidelines that we were testing with the field trial for wildfire protection, we work with RDH, Robin Urquhart, notably in Graham Finch, to develop this tiered set of wildfire protection practices. They draw heavily on the NRC Wildfire Guide, on the US IWEC, on FireSmart recommendations for home ignition zones. And I would also note that we're kind of following along in the work that RDH had done after the Lytton fire, where they had developed a practical document for the building industry to apply wildfire protection, the technical sheets for wildfire resistant construction that were meant to support rebuilding in Lytton. At a high level, wildfire protection generally at the site scale includes two elements: management of fuel, management of the home ignition zones, and addressing the building through cladding features, decks, combustible features, largely related to the building envelope and cladding. The approach that was adopted in our guidelines includes a mix of these two options, where if you apply more stringent building requirements, you can apply less stringent home ignition zone measures and vice versa. So as you progress in your home ignition zone measures, you can sort of relax on the building side measures. And this is consistent with the approach in the NRC Wildfire Guide, which uses a combination of exposure level and recommended building protection practices. We've floated this concept and the NRC Wildfire Guide for several years by builders and the insurance industry, and they had trouble sort of grasping the concept or latching on to the concept of fuel versus building practices. So one of the things we wanted to do in the guidelines was make it fairly clear what the relationship meant, or how you would apply the relationship between building measures and landscape fuel measures. And so generally, we have good, better, best for home ignition zone management and construction measures. As you move up the tiers for construction measures, you would sort of be allotted to apply less stringent tiers for home ignition zones. In terms of the practices themselves, this is the example, the basic level practices, the good practices, which are really aimed at protecting buildings from ember ignitions. It includes minimums like multi-pane windows, non-combustible roof cover, flashings, valleys, and so on, non-combustible fencing around the building, roof venting with openings no larger than 3 millimeters, metal non-combustible gutters and downspouts, making sure that we have a non-combustible gap between potentially combustible siding and the ground, and addressing vulnerabilities associated with decks. That's our basic protection practice. And again, application of these practices kind of depends on more stringent practices on the home ignition zone side. As we move up the tiers, we include now ignition resistant window frames, screens on openable windows, vents addressing wall vents and flashings, including windows with tempered window panes, fire rated doors, deck surfaces, eaves and soffits finished with metal. So as we move up the tiers, we add additional construction measures. And then the highest tier includes additional measures like non-combustible siding, fire resistance ratings for exterior walls, extending the home ignition zone fence protections beyond just the immediate zone. So as we move up these tiers, we add measures and also add some construction costs for the buildings. So I mentioned before, we would balance the building measures and the home ignition zone measures. And so this is an example of what we would recommend in terms of application of the good practices for wildfire protection and the best practices for home ignition zone protection. The best practices would include management of Zone 1A, Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3. So all of the relevant home ignition zone areas around the building, if you want to sort of safely apply those minimum practices. And conversely, if you're not able to manage those home ignition zones fully around the building, then the recommendations are to apply more stringent building protection practices as outlined in the good practices, which are consistent with the full set of Fire Smart or NRC wildfire guide practices. So turning back now specifically to the field trials and getting into the case study specifically near Fernie. So we started the field trial process with CHBA back in 2024. We sent out a call for proposals, and we worked through a process, an IDP process supported by CHBA and also Building Knowledge Canada. We had some initial applications back in December 2024. We worked through a process with each of the builders that included sort of initial meetings with them, sitting down with them, walking through their building plans and the resilience recommendations. They would take the resilience recommendations back and work in more detail with their teams, identify what they could potentially apply. And then we prepared for IDP sessions. So we had one-day IDP sessions with all of the builders involved. After those IDP sessions, we continued the technical discussions. And now across our field trials, we're sort of in the construction phase. Some are further along than others, but that's where we are now. Because we conducted this in partnership with CHBA, we had some sort of caveats for applications. Members had to be, or the applicants had to be CHB members. We were focusing on Part 9 construction. We were aiming for completion of buildings in 2026. Buildings had to be exposed to one of our relevant hazards. They had to be located in a populated area. So there were some cases where we had requests for field trials in really isolated areas, but we wanted to conduct field trials in an area where we could potentially have tours and that sort of thing in the future. So we focused on populated areas, standard construction methods, so steep slope roofs, wood frame construction. In the case of the big block field trial, it is modular construction. And we had some exclusions for severe hazards for floods specifically. And we were also involved sort of requirements for marketing and public outputs from the projects. So the field trial for big block construction is just outside of the town of Fernie, or city of Fernie in British Columbia. It's a multi-unit residential site. There's going to be 10 buildings there. The initial phase is 2 buildings. You can see them, the design here. They're 4 units, 2 units on top, 2 units on the bottom, being sold sort of as condos. Here's the location. You can see Fernie in the middle, and it's right on the Fernie Alpine Resort land. So technically, the jurisdiction is Regional District of East Kootenay, not City of Fernie, although City of Fernie is involved in the Fire Smart practices for the region. The site itself is in a forested area. It's on a slope. There was so as I mentioned before, we got 10 buildings, 4 units per building. The buildings themselves are about 6,000 square feet with a 2,200 square foot building footprint area. There's 6-meter setbacks and so on. You can see the layout of the site there. It is considered to be through the City of Fernie's wildfire protection plan to be in a high exposure area for wildfire. So this is part of the impetus to focus on wildfire protection as well. You can check out the site, the development itself on the website there, currycreek.ca. They're selling the units now. I also wanted to point out that they're at the stage where they're marketing the buildings and include multiple sort of features of the buildings, such as wildfire protective construction practices. So that's been a feature of the marketing for the site. And you can check out also on our task force site. There's a recent TD Stories article that sort of includes an interview with the local FireSmart representatives and Alex Miller, the CEO of Big Block Construction. So in terms of selection of measures, as I mentioned before, we did a series of meetings. We had RDH Building Science involved as the cladding and wildfire envelope experts. The first sort of, I guess, milestone was the design charrette that we held with Big Block near the site in Fernie on the Fernie Alpine Resort in January of 2025. I think it's important to identify who was involved. So the point of the IDP sessions is to have a wide cross-section of building company staff representing different elements of responsibilities in the building company. So with the owner, we had the project manager, architect related people, marketing people there. So we wanted to get sort of multiple perspectives from the building company on each of the resilience measures. The structural engineer was there, their representative structural engineer, as well as their energy auditor. And then we had FireSmart representation from local, regional, provincial, and national FireSmart offices. That included Regional District of East Kootenay, BC FireSmart, and FireSmart Canada. RDH was there representing the enclosure aspect of the work, and CHP ICLR were there as well. And then we had Building Knowledge Canada involved. And Building Knowledge Canada has been running these types of sessions across Canada for a long time, especially for energy efficiency, high performance building design. And as a new concept, resilience, we wanted to make sure that we're kind of following the same structure that builders were used to. So it was important to involve a trusted moderator at the sessions. So that was sort of an important detail of conducting these sessions. At each of the sessions, we started with overviews or detailed overviews of resilience measures. So Alex Miller, Big Block Construction, provided a general overview of the site. ICLR talked about the purpose of the field trials. FireSmart Canada talked about their programs. BC FireSmart provided a review of landscaping or home ignition zone recommendations. And then RDH provided the detailed enclosure discussion. And then after that, we had breakout discussions with everybody at the sessions. We had 3 breakout sessions that focused on landscaping practices, building enclosure details, and owner-occupant community impacts associated with the application of the measures. And we walked through each of these breakout exercises 2 specific exercises where we had each of the resilience measures available, and we walked through them and rated them in terms of the impact on design, the impact on constructability for the building, whether owners would accept these measures, the hard cost associated with applying these measures, and also the potential maintenance aspect of including these measures. So we try to get into these details for every single one of the measures that we presented to the group, both on the building envelope side and on the landscaping side. And then we also went through an exercise where we prioritized each of the measures for the field trial. So we had 17 home ignition zone measures that we walked through and about 38 building measures. So it took some time to walk through each of these measures and conduct both of those exercises. But it was meant to be a very thorough introduction and review and discussion with the building company about whether or not the measures were practical. So I'll quickly run through some of the landscaping discussions. So we had actually some meetings before the IDP session focused on landscaping. Big Block provided their initial landscaping plans and renderings of the buildings. We worked through those renderings and identified some potential issues. So there were, for example, plans to include pine potentially on site. There's some other species that were going to be included in the landscaping features like pin cherry, rabbit brush, fescues. And we worked with BC FireSmart and actually used their online tool, which is really, really helpful to identify which species would be more fire vulnerable. We made a sort of series of recommendations related to ground cover. This again is from the online tool indicating where certain ground covers could be used in different home ignition zones around the building. This was an important input as well. Some initial recommendations. They're meant to reflect the desire to have a nice looking landscape. So, including nice looking trees and flowering bushes and that sort of thing, that we wanted to make sure that was retained, but that we were also selecting fire or species that were not fire vulnerable. And so we went through this exercise with the builder and made these recommendations. I'll leave the slides with you to walk through. And the recommendations were varied based on the home ignition zone. So the recommendations include non-combustibles in the immediate zone, and then relaxed requirements as we moved out through the home ignition zones into the less sort of high priority home ignition zones. Some of the conclusions from the IDP session were that home ignition zone recommendations beyond 10 to 30 meters, especially given that the layout of the site were largely outside the scope of the developer. And I should mention that big block was both developer and builder, and that maintenance items that are included in the wildfire recommendations from FireSmart are not in scope of the developer per se, but they could be included in strata rules or condominium agreements for the site. The highly accessible, so we had each of the measures recommended for home ignition zones and buildings ranked in terms of their accessibility, from, we use the term no-brainers to like not possible for the site. So some of the no-brainers that were identified during the session were FireSmart recommended plant and tree species and use of non-combustible materials for ground cover. Those are some of the more accessible measures identified in the session. And some higher potential measures, but not necessarily shoe-ins, were managing the intermediate zone and management of fuel beyond in the extended zone through maintenance recommendations. For building measures, the no-brainers included non-combustible exposed foundations, addressing 3mm gaps in exterior walls and non-combustible siding and trim. In the case of this building, non-combustible siding was already going to be incorporated into the build because it's more of an upper end site. Class A roof cover, non-combustible flashings, addressing 3mm openings in roof covers was considered to be an accessible measure. Non-combustible rainware, drip edge, gutters, downspouts, and addressing the immediate zone like ground cover under decks and non-combustible deck components were considered to be highly accessible measures during the IDP session. Measures that were considered high potential included initially tempered pane exterior windows, fire-rated doors, tempered glass door lights, non-combustible window screens, garage door options that included making sure there are no gaps in garage doors over 3mm. And some possible options included doors and window frames with non-combustible, doors and windows with non-combustible frames, non-combustible decks, balconies, and attachments, and enclosed underdeck areas. And I should note that the theme here is that this was the initial review at the IDP session, and as we moved along, looking for suppliers and so on, some of these measures were kind of walked back, but that's just part of the process of applying a field trial. So aside from the field trial session itself, the IDP session, after that session, there were still a lot of discussions that occurred between our envelope specialist, ICLR, and Big Block. So the IDP session did not necessarily, seal or cement the options that would be included in the building. There's still lots of discussion that had to go on afterwards. And it was sort of decided that they would generally focus, aim toward the better construction measures. There are some measures that were ruled out later on due to costs, like tempered pane windows, wall assemblies with fire resistance ratings, and so on. It required some more sort of exploration by the builder before a good sort of decision could be made about those practices. So I'll quickly walk through measures that were adopted. And again, this is in the paper, and there's some tables there that indicate what was adopted based on the tiers that we use for the protection classes or the wildfire guidelines. So in terms of the good practices, essentially all of the good practices were adopted: non-combustible roof cover, multi-pane windows, Class A roof cover, metal roof openings, addressing 3 mm vents, gutters and downspouts, underdeck areas, non-combustible area close to the surface of the ground. Those were all fairly accessible measures. As we moved up the tiers, some of the things that were ruled out were tempered pane windows just because of the cost. But a number of additional measures were incorporated. Most of the measures were incorporated, with some measures still sort of up for decision based on the status of construction. They're still looking into fire-rated doors and so on. But for the most part, the good and better practices were accessible for the builder. In terms of hazard ignition, home ignition zones, and landscaping practices, so the construction is still underway. The team did map out the home ignition zones for the site and have proposed several options based on the Fire Smart recommendations. So non-combustible ground cover in the immediate zone, rock and concrete ground cover and so on would be used or is recommended for application. Some of the combustible materials have been moved out of the more immediate home ignition zones, and species have been selected using the Fire Smart recommendations. So both the building measures up to largely the better tier and most of the home ignition zone measures for the site specifically were adoptable. So some conclusions from this initial field trial, and as I mentioned before, we've got several of these field trials ongoing. One is that it's important to incorporate resilience measures early in the design process. So as I mentioned before, we engaged CHBA and potential builders back in December 2024 with a deadline of having construction completed by 2026. In order for projects with construction to be complete by 2026, we're largely working with home builders that had designs that were already submitted for permits. And so we didn't have a lot of latitude to change materials and design practices. So our field trials with 1 to 2 year timelines don't always align with construction schedules. So where builders are looking to apply resilience measures, we would recommend like very, very early adoption. And we would suggest moving that IDP 1-day session to very early in the process, as opposed to the status where we had an opportunity to engage them with our field trials. Alex Miller and the Big Block team are using modular construction. One of the findings of this work is that modular construction, there's no hindrance to applying these measures with modular construction. If anything, it facilitated application of these measures. There were some supply chain gaps. There is, in some cases, limited product in Canada. Often we're relying on US testing standards or California testing standards. That is a gap in the Canadian market. So the more that we can build the supply side of the resilience supply chain, the better we'll be. And that relates really to things like non-combustible doors, tempered pane windows with non-combustible frames that are accessible at a reasonable cost. One of the things we hear about often is lack of availability of sort of off-the-shelf venting products that include 3mm mesh. These are all areas where there were some issues in terms of finding product. Resilience there is some increase in upfront cost. The marketing benefits are not still clear in every case, but they're relatively small in this case. We have other field trials where the costs were a bit higher, but there is potential for sort of addressing these costs with marketing approaches. One of the important findings, I think, also is that, at least so far, the field trial is showing us that managing the home ignition zone seems to be much more accessible than many of the building level elements. And so, as I was showing before, most of the home ignition zone measures will be applied for the site. And so that's an option for builder developers, is to really focus on home ignition zone options in place of many sort of more expensive building level measures. Another thing that we're finding, not just in this field trial, but generally, is that builders lack accessible information on hazards. So I showed earlier the City of Fernie's Community Wildfire Protection Plan that does provide hazard information on wildfire exposure in the Fernie area. This is not a document that is usually reviewed, I think, by builders, and there is information available on wildfire exposure, and that goes for hail exposure and many types of flood exposure, but it's really not in a format that builders find useful. And so it did require sort of like, working with ICLR and the envelope expert to bring that information to the table and make it something that actually was compelling to the builder. So this is still a major gap in Canada, is readily accessible hazards information, especially because we're dealing with voluntary protection practices. The FireSmart planting tool was a great example of an accessible tool that was really helpful in defining what to do on the home ignition zone side. So that serves as a good example of what we should be doing in with respect to resilience, to making sure that these measures are accessible. Another issue or potential barrier is the technical expertise that's required to support builders on wildfire protection. So there's a lot of details when it comes to dealing with venting and sealing elements of exterior walls and selecting materials that we did require some expertise in the form of RDH's envelope expert that was really helpful for the field trial. And there's very limited expertise in this area in Canada. So building up the consultant side, the enclosure consultant side, should be considered as an important element of building capacity for application of these measures. With respect to marketing, there were some legal considerations about how the resilience measures were presented. We can't necessarily make performance promises to a buyer about buildings that are resilient. So the marketing for the site really had to focus on materials that were tested and were shown through engineering tests to perform well under fire loads, as opposed to making a general claim about performance of the buildings during wildfire events. So that's something to be careful about. And this all relates to consumer protection laws in Canada. And another supply chain issue that's not less related to material availability, but more the relationship that builders have with their suppliers and their installers. And not so much in this field trial, but in some of the other field trials, we were exploring application of new materials that the builders' installers were not familiar with. So that required training the installers or finding new installers to apply the materials, like different siding materials. If a builder is used to working with a vinyl installer, they have to train them on fiber cement or aluminum. And that's actually a bigger ask than sometimes we think it is. It takes some time to get them up to speed. It takes time to find supply, and there could be mistakes in application of these measures, especially in the early days. So these are factors that we should consider when making these recommendations. And a few last comments about the IDP and field trial process generally that'll influence what we do in the next phases of our field trials. So I would break out the experience in this field trial into 5 different phases. There was an initial introduction and exploration phase where the builder was sort of learning about the resilience measures. At that stage, it was important to have very simple, clear documentation, like our guidelines, our tier guidelines, that we could share with the builder. They could quickly work through and sort of get a sense of what they're already doing, and then meet with them and explain measures that they didn't understand, or clarify measures. That was an important initial step of our field trial process. The IDP sessions were, of course, important. I think sometimes when we're talking about field trials and IDP sessions, we end at the IDP session itself, and we don't carry through to the actual implementation. But we learned a lot as we continued along the different phases of the field trial. So after the IDP session, as I mentioned before, there were even more detailed technical discussions. This is the stage where we got into issues like costing and supply materials, and had to sort of land on some compromises where, although we're promoting to the extent possible full application of wildfire protection practices, we had to understand and accept that a lot of the practices were not practical in the field trial. Compromises were driven by availability of material, cost, installation constraints, and we only really get to that phase by continuing on from the IDP session, and when we really start exploring actual application of the measures. The next phase involved internal planning, sourcing, product selection, discussion with trades and installers. Again, we get really important insight from these discussions that are fed back into our process that we miss without going through the whole process of applying the measures in the field. And then finally, construction, where additional factors become apparent, like practical issues when the installers are actually installing product. What are the issues they face when it's a new product, and so on. So I think we kind of get to phase 1 or 2 often, and we forget we miss these additional phases that are important outcomes of field trials. I mentioned before that the physical implementation of measures really changes the discussion about resilience. It changes it drastically when we go from theoretical or academic recommendations to practical recommendations. It really seems to help make the discussions with the building industry much cleaner. They can see more clearly what we're recommending. Watching their peers apply the practice has a lot of impact for them as well. So these are further reasons why the field trial process is important. In a more recent field trial, our IDP sessions initially were focused on understanding practicality and potential for applying our resilience practices for the field trial project itself, which is often a single demonstration home or a demonstration site. In our most recent IDP session with a major builder, we started also including discussion about application of the measures for all future builds. And that gets you a different response than if you're talking about a demonstration home. So now in our future IDP sessions, we'll talk about both the demonstration home, the demonstration site, and potential application of measures by the builder for all future projects. And the chart on the right, or the table on the right, the black X's are measures that this builder will consider for a demonstration project, and the red X's indicate measures that they're going to consider for all their future builds. And in many cases, these align, like there are practices that could be applied across builds. So that's something we'll build into our future field trials as well. So in terms of status of this project, construction is underway. Keith and I were at the factory in Winkler, Manitoba, and Alex and the team in Winkler gave us a good walk through the buildings. The buildings are being marketed. You can check out the site curragcreek.ca, and you can see exactly how they're referencing wildfire protection in their marketing packages. So I'll end it there. As I mentioned before, this work continues. This is one field trial of many. I think we'll learn more as we continue with these field trials. We hope to do many more of these over the next few years with our ongoing agreement with the task force. And as always, whoever's listening, if you are interested in reviewing the guidelines specifically, please review them, send your comments. These are meant to be updated frequently, at least in the first couple of years. So we're interested in your feedback and send it our way. Thanks a lot, Keith.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. You gave a very information-rich talk. And that's good and bad. I don't want people to conflate all the information you gave with complexity. I don't want people saying, well, I can't remember everything Dan said, so it must be too hard to replicate. If somebody wanted to share this stuff with a builder, where's the on-ramp? If they were, if they knew some early adopter type builder who was willing to try good or better, is there a self-guided way to do all this, or do they have to come to you, or how does one begin?
Yeah, so I would say go to what I always recommend when we talk to a new renovator or builder or restoration contractor. I say go to the website. So the website's put right there, and just have a quick look at the guidelines. If you're interested in hail, if you're interested in wind, just review the tier guidelines. Start with good. I think you'll probably find that you're already applying a lot of the measures, and you can just check off what you're applying. That's what we're finding with many of the renovators and builders that we're working with. They're already applying a lot of these measures for reasons aside from resilience. So that's where I would start. Also at that website, we have a link that will bring you to examples of field trials. So there's newspaper reports and videos and so on from some of our field trial participants. So that's a good place to start as well.
Wonderful. Steve Reed asks, he says, part of my role includes bringing WUI resiliency, wildland urban interface fire resiliency into our municipal legislation. To that end, we've done comprehensive public and trade education and engagement and have broad support for changes to building materials, specifically requiring non-combustible roofing and rainwear. It means eaves, gutters, etc. However, as a jurisdiction that uses the National Building Code, we have received pushback from the city's building department suggesting our building bylaw cannot exceed NBC requirements. Any suggestions for how we move this conversation forward?
Yeah. Sorry, did you say the jurisdiction that they were working in, Keith?
No, Steve did not name the jurisdiction.
Okay, yeah. So for most of Canada, aside from BC, that's the case. Local bylaws can't exceed construction code requirements. So part of the reason why we're working with the home building industry and CHBA is we're looking for opportunities for voluntary application of resilience. I would say a good place to start, if you're in a wildfire-prone area, you might already have a building community that is interested in this topic. They just don't know where to start. And so hosting sessions with builders, and ideally finding a builder that's already applying these practices and having them lead sessions is a good way to get around this issue of jurisdictional authority. We found some success with incentive programs. But I think you might find if you're in a wildfire-prone area, there is already some interest in desire to apply these practices. So I would start with working with the building industry directly and finding some allies there.
Awesome. Anshul, I'm gonna come to your question next, but first I want to preface it. I want to sort of build up to your question. Dan, there's a learning curve to adding new features to a building. I might imagine that adding $2,700 in costs for good or $6,600 in costs for better might be the first time through, and the effort might decrease the second or third time through. Do we have any evidence to test that intuition?
Yeah, so so far, most of the costs that we've been collecting for the field trials have been for just materials, and they haven't been for labor costs. So I think that as it stands right now, those are kind of hard costs that are hard to avoid. We haven't seen, I know we've had this discussion so far, but we haven't seen many cases where builders are sort of like finding opportunities to reduce those costs yet. I think they probably will eventually. For sure, there are some issues that become much clearer that with respect to time requirements and resource requirements for new materials that won't be there as they continue these practices. So I take an example, one of our field trials, they applied a whole new siding. It was engineered wood siding, and they're used to applying vinyl siding. And in order to apply engineered wood siding, they had to work with their installers. They had to get them to go to some training. They had to source the material. There's a lot of back and forth with the siding manufacturer. But once those supply chains are established, they can avoid all of that work. And it really comes down to just sourcing the material. I would say also some of the materials are expensive because they're not available in our market. Things like, tempered pane windows, screened attic venting, that sort of thing. And so there's sort of like not just a cost constraint, but a supply constraint. So they can't even get them in a reasonable time. If we continue asking for these measures, if we build enough momentum in the industry where we get requests for these materials and they start to be offered by suppliers, that barrier is dropped as well. So I think we're still in early days, and for sure there's opportunities to drop the overall cost and effort that's required to apply these measures.
And have we seen yet anybody sort of finding a way to offset that $2,700 or that $6,600 through economies elsewhere in the building, and any ability or maybe willingness to do that?
Yeah, it really wasn't. I wouldn't say there's not an opportunity there. It wasn't really part of the discussion with the field trials. The field trials were meant just to get the measures applied and to explore the cost of measures. I would say that we know from our insurance members, insurers that apply Build Back Better practices, where there's a potential increment in cost for rebuilding with more resilient measures, they're finding ways through their claims process to reduce cost, to cover those additional costs. But I would say at this stage, it wasn't part of our field trials, but that's something we should definitely explore with our builders in the future.
Okay, great. Now I'm going to turn to Anshal. I'm going to guess it's pronounced Mola, um, who was asking about insurance costs. What are the average costs for insurance policies for those homes? And through this pilot, are subsidies being offered by insurance companies for the resilience measures that are being implemented? Their research has highlighted that because the cost to rebuild is much higher, the cost of policies increases as well. This has become an additional deterrent to taking these actions. And I want to add in my own take on that question. The $6,600 and the $2,200, that's initial capital costs. You don't actually pay that. You pay a mortgage, where that additional 10 grand might turn into, I don't know what, tens of dollars per month. Are we seeing anything like, are there insurers who are going to offset those tens of dollars per month in premium reductions? Or is anybody recognizing these features as rating factors?
Yeah. So beyond Wildfire, so Wildfire, yes. There are a couple of companies, notably in British Columbia, that are offering incentives to homes that have wildfire protection practices. And we really see this come into play for hail protection in the Calgary area, for basement flood protection in different parts of Canada that have recurrent basement flood impacts. In those cases, there are like significant premium reductions, availability considerations, improved deductibles, like across the board insurance term improvements associated with application of resilience measures. Wildfire is still a bit new. We're not seeing that so much for wildfire yet, aside from a couple of companies in BC, but it's very strongly established for basement flood protection, and increasingly for hail, and also in some jurisdictions for wind.
Awesome. Is it too early now for builders to turn around and talk to their industry about their field trials, like, attesting to the practicality? I mean, is it up to Resilient Homes Task Force to be, broadcasting this, or is any of this information sort of getting out without you intervening?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is getting out through us and ICLR and our partnership with CHBA. So we provide a lot of opportunities to talk to the building industry, but we're encouraging builders as well. So part of the purpose of the field trials is to create builders that can also become advocates for the concept of resilience. And I would say the builders that have been involved in this work have become advocates. And there's an example, Interquality, back in March 2020, March of this year, hosted an awards event, and they gave an award to one of our field trial participants, partly motivated by the resilience field trial, and they had several sections focused on resilience. And that was a session that was fully motivated and developed by the building industry for other builders, largely because of the field trials and the task force, the demonstration of a partnership between the insurance industry and the building industry. So we're seeing it more frequently as a topic of interest for the building industry, and they're starting to talk about it themselves. I've also heard from some of the bigger consulting firms. So I mentioned Building Knowledge Canada, RDH. RDH is becoming kind of like a center of expertise on wildfire and envelopes, and they consult with builders across Canada and North America. Same with Building Knowledge Canada. I actually heard of an example. Building Knowledge Canada was consulting with a builder in the GTA, and they asked specifically about resilience, like unprompted by us. So I think by working with builders, we're getting the message out through their industry.
Are we hearing yet? I think you said it's kind of early days for to judge the efficacy of these features as a market feature. Are we hearing anything yet from builders about buyers' enthusiasm?
Yeah. Well, so the big block is the first one to really sort of explicitly market the resilience features. That's going to be part of the work with Avalon in Calgary as well, and we're working toward it. And like the newspaper articles are all part of that marketing exercise. So they are marketing it. Whether they're seeing a change in demand because of it, I can't tell you yet. I mean, we have consulted with a number of builders in Calgary, and what they're telling us is like people are not necessarily asking for it yet, but they also haven't been marketing it. So we're hoping through the field trials, when they start marketing these measures, we'll start to see examples or case studies of where buyers, react positively to these measures, and we can use this to motivate other builders to market these measures as well.
What about other players? I'm sorry, I was making notes and you may have actually answered this question, but what is our interaction so far with FireSmart? Are they flogging this stuff? Are municipalities doing so? Are you finding any fire departments talking about it?
Yeah, there for sure. I mean, municipalities and FireSmart and fire departments, others have been talking about FireSmart for a long time, but haven't necessarily involved the building sector directly. Whether or not they're promoting building measures as a market feature of homes or renovations, I haven't seen that necessarily. But I think these examples are going to provide a good baseline for that. Also, your work on how resale homes are being marketed with resilience features, and the cost is potentially higher for these homes, has been influential too, for especially the builders. They like to see that information.
Oh yeah, and so for others who haven't heard about that, we've been doing some analysis of sale prices of homes with and without resilience features. And we can, we found that adding a resilience feature and mentioning it in the free text part of a home listing increases the resale value of a resilient home by 20 grand, $40,000 in Alberta for fire resistant features, $50,000 in Toronto for flood resistant features. So that's what Dan means by my work on increased resale value. I'm at a conference in Nova Scotia that's all about energy, and we, of course, when you're talking with people about net zero and stuff, they want to know what is the synergy between net zero and resilience. Have we seen any interaction? Has that come up in the Resilient Homes Task Force yet?
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, a lot of the measures are somewhat independent. So, notably for base of flood and hail. For wildfire, there is some crossover. So the building envelope insulation systems, there is some benefit for energy efficiency. Part of the basic recommendations for wildfire protection are multi-pane windows, which have energy benefits. So there is some crossover. I would say it's not a huge amount of crossover, but the more expensive options tend to also provide some energy efficiency benefits, like the building envelope costs or measures associated with wildfire protection.
So we got a bunch of, it's probably primarily insurance people in the webinar today. What kinds of roles among ICLR's members, among insurers, ought to hear about the field trials and the task force? I'm thinking of people on the call right now who are sort of vaguely interested, but this material doesn't quite hit squarely in their job description. What roles in an insurance company gets the most value from the field trials? I mean, if somebody on the call wanted to tell somebody else in their company, oh, you got to watch this webinar, who's that somebody else?
Yeah, so I would say those staff involved in reconstruction, those who are concerned about supply chain issues for Build Back Better practices. And we have engaged with the restoration contracting industry fairly heavily over the past few years on these topics. And so working with those vendors and advising them, I think they might be interested in these practical examples. And we will also be interested in, and we have already a number of times presented to claim staff at insurance companies and walk them through like the specific resilience options. And that's something that resonates with claim staff as they look to implement Build Back Better practices specifically.
Cool. Dan Stevens asks, you mentioned Alberta and Toronto benefiting from, oh, he's talking to me. I mentioned Alberta and Toronto sellers benefiting from resale value. do I happen to have any information for British Columbia? Dan, that work is in progress right now. So check back in with us. Drop me a line in a month or two, and I'll have some news from BC, I hope. Let's see. Let me ask you maybe one last question, then we can do a wrap up. We ICLR like to simplify stuff for retrofit. When it comes to retrofit, we like to say, do this one thing, or do these two things, or do these three things, because people can wrap their minds around one, two, or three things that a building owner can do, and it's less overwhelming. But that's less of an issue with new buildings, isn't it? I mean, builders deal with huge to-do lists all the time. You went through this long story about the integrated design process. First you do the charrette, and then you do this, then you do that, and that's not really that big a deal for a builder, is it? All those details.
No, it's not. It's not a big deal. In fact, in many cases, they're already doing that work, and we're kind of just fitting into the existing process. I was kind of highlighting those as I'm trying to emphasize the importance of getting away from like our sort of typical desk-based exercises in the climate change adaptation, policy community, and highlighting like what it really takes to get from theoretical academic recommendations to actual implementation with the building sector. So we apply the integrated design process because it is a standard process in the building sector. They do it all the time, especially if they're integrating a new a concept or practice. And so we're just fitting ourselves into an existing practice, using the same contractors, making the same arguments, just from a different perspective. It's not a big deal. That's not the part that was a challenge. I think the major challenge in the building sector, it's not any of this stuff. It's not the measures, the number of measures, or the cost or the supply. I think it's just awareness. They just don't know that this is something they can pursue. Like when we have done these IDP sessions with builders in a builder in Calgary, and we talked about class 4 shingles, he's like, I didn't know I could ask my supplier for class 4 shingles. That afternoon, he calls him up and says, can we buy class 4? And he's like, no problem. They just never asked for it before. And a lot of builders, again, they're making a decision between certain types of siding, wood siding or non-combustible siding, and they just need that additional argument from the Wildfire side that it's worth going with the non-combustible siding. So I think our challenge is not so much the process and working with every single builder on these processes. It's getting the basic information. What are we trying to achieve? Look what we can do, in our good tier practices. That's not complex. It's not expensive. The more that we do that, I think that's where we'll make the change in this industry.
You're breaking through a false barrier of where people conflate, I've never done that before, with it's not possible.
Right. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so you have any final thoughts for our attendees before we wrap up? Any one big takeaway you'd have them leave with?
No, I mean, I think the takeaway is that I think ICLR is finding some success working with the building industry in this way. I think we're moving from theoretical recommendations to practical recommendations does require working with the building industry. And I would say I also get the same types of requests for information from insurers and restoration contractors. So if there's anything of value here, or any information that you would like tailored for your company, or the vendors that you work with, that's something that we should explore with you. We would be happy to do.
Awesome. Okay, thanks again, Dan. To everybody else, remember that you're going to find video, audio, a transcript, and Dan's deck by Monday at www.iclr.org/workshops. Join us in 2 weeks to hear about the tools that show how wildfire spreads into communities. And Coco, I'm so sorry that you asked your question right as I was asking Dan to wrap up. Maybe Dan, Coco, hang on as we conclude, or maybe Dan, grab a copy of Coco's question there and see if you can reply by email or something. In any case, I hope everybody has a great weekend. This was a great talk, Dan. Thanks again.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.